welcome. Want to invite everybody to an overview of Land EKG and just kind of our approach to monitoring. We're coming to you using a different platform than we've used in the past. We're using it's called Adobe Connect, and one of the advantages of that is that you can try it out to compare. We oftentimes use the GoToWebinar or GoToWebinar or GoToMeeting format or platform, which is how we've delivered our Google Earth webinars. But in this case, we're trying the Adobe Connect. There's a lot of features that we like about it. Unfortunately, the trial version only allows like 5 people onto the webinar, and we just discovered that. So we're getting folks calling in saying, hey, it says it's booked, and at this point in time this whole thing is being recorded, so we're just going to work our way through it. Jesse will follow up with email to a link, and if nothing else, we're going to make it so that you folks have a chance to watch the recording, if nothing else. So with that, I think I'll just go ahead and start to work my way through. My name's Charlie Orchard. I'm working with Tom Bogan, Renee Hockaday, and Jesse Bussard, and that's our gang right there. We're doing a lot of fun things, and it's been encouraging to get a chance to work with everybody with the skills that they have. One of the main concepts, that the idea behind Land EKG is that we really specialize basically in helping people to pay attention to the land, and we do this through training and equipping land managers, land stewards, what we've found to be the most effective ways to monitor, and certainly certain management practices relative to landscapes that they're working with. The idea has been to keep a simple approach, very practical method, and make it so that it provides profitable results in the end. And probably the premise of all of this is the fact that in agriculture we've got to understand and recognize that all we're doing is turning sunlight, photons of energy, through the photosynthetic process, turning that energy into food and fiber, primarily through grazing. That's where we've been focused towards. But ultimately, those animals are sold and turn into money, and that's what keeps the business going. And so we really are kind of use sunlight salesmen or solar commodity brokers or starlight energy transfer specialists. Those are all big names for and what I feel probably more accurately describes what it is that we do. So we turn sunlight into money itself. And one additional management premise is that the foundation for wealth really does lie in the land. And Granite always said, the profit is in the grass. He said to be sure and take care of it. And you can tell just from a picture like this, as he told me, you'll always make more money putting poor animals on good land than you ever will putting good animals on poor land. The profit is always in the grass, and that's what we have to recognize, and that's what we have to always keep front and center. So ultimately, a thriving ecosystem really is the only way to create or optimize the profit or the economic returns for the ranch itself. It's really about the health of the land and the land resources, and so that's where we really focus towards. And the question always comes down to how do you manage anything, a landscape, when you don't measure it or you don't track it in some form or fashion. And so that's what we have started moving towards. And so being able to track, being able to monitor, it's got to have a full, valuable benefit, and that purpose must drive it. And it can't be something to just create more work, because everybody that's out there is extremely busy. And so our number one premise behind monitoring is that it's to help any landowner, manager, steward make grazing or other management decisions, to help them be able to understand the cause of problems rather than just kind of consider from a holistic perspective rather than considering just the symptoms that one might be viewing. And when we think about the improved management decisions, really the benefits have to kind of be broad-based in the fact that they benefit the economics and they benefit the ecology. I've heard Dave Pratt speak of this saying econology. It's the study and the practice of econology when it comes down to ranching and ranch management. And so what we're trying to do is effectively use monitoring to determine the cause of problems, if there are any, to certainly make decisions, and as I mentioned, optimize the economic returns and create a sustained ecological function within the system itself. In addition to that, many of us out in the West, or for those of us where any kind of grazing lease security is an issue, private land lease, state land lease, BLM, Forest Service lease, whether you're in some of the provinces in Canada, there's more and more pressure on producers to be able to, or land stewards to be able to validate their management practices. And so the ability to clearly validate, the condition and function of the land is something that is ultimately moved or emerged as a high priority. And so in our approach, what we're really trying to do is or anybody's approach, quite frankly, is the idea is to have a rapid, consistent, and an objective way to take measurements that allows you to defend or to substantiate the results of the management practices. An example of some of that relative to some of the pressures, there's a number of environmental groups that are out there. In this case, this is a group based out of Idaho. They're commonly dealing with legal situations, appeals against districts, federal districts, typically forest or BLM, and they've had a number of successes. And the interesting part is that they're very proud to advertise those successes. And what we need to do is be able to step up and be able to make it where that we as land stewards can promote and talk about the successes that we've had relative to ecological function and stability, improvement of watersheds, any number of things that grazing animals can ultimately produce. So, when you start trying to get your head around monitoring, what are parts of monitoring that we've found to be most useful producers? And we've kind of broken this down into one of our best explanations of monitoring. We've been working at it for 20 plus years, or I have been actually since the late 80s, trying to figure out, how do I answer the question for this pasture? What do I do next that will be, the best thing that I can do? And with what we've got with Land EKG, it's something that we think we're definitely on the right path. We're constantly learning more, and there's new information, new technology that's always coming out there. But we've got a monitoring pyramid model that I will go through here shortly that really breaks out the whole notion of monitoring, and it's something that we've found extremely helpful in getting anybody's head wrapped around how does monitoring work. We've worked and are continually trying to find rancher-friendly type monitoring devices. We've got a methodology that we have found has been a breakthrough methodology for us, which is called EKG Blink monitoring, and it's one that I just continue to think that we've really knocked on the right door there with, because it's rapid, it's repeatable, it's objective. It doesn't necessarily require plant identification, and that's oftentimes an intimidating aspect for people that are wanting to get into the monitoring concept or engage in monitoring. And then we've got a level that also allows us to truly track ecological health, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But even just thinking about a landscape like this, where would I even begin? And oftentimes, one question comes up is how much time should I spend in the monitoring process? I mean, throughout a year, do I need to go out there, one time a month, 5 times a month, 5 times a year, once a year? How does it work? And based on my experience right now, I believe 1%, maybe 2%. If you think about this, if you're making your income, 100% of your income from the land, do you not think that you can afford to take 1% of your working time? Maybe 2%, but 1 for sure, to go back to the land. And so that amounts to 3 to 4 days worth of time. And so I believe that that's a reasonable way to approach it. And so that's kind of how we work towards that. This is just a diagram of our monitoring pyramid, and you'll see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 levels, and I'm just going to work from the base. And this is what we call the initial tier of monitoring, and this is what every person out there should be able to do easily and effectively. And the idea here is that the lower portion of the pyramid primarily allows feedback for management, for decisions to be made. The upper part of the pyramid we'll talk about has to do more with being able to provide credibility, and so the methods higher up provide the credibility that we need. But we'll start here on the initial low side, and it's so effectively just very general pasture monitoring tactics and tools, understanding our soils, some of the potentials of particular areas of our landscapes, using grazing cages, understanding how to use rain gauges, certainly tracking, just keeping track of records, and I call this pens. Recovery pens is the word that we commonly use, and I'm just going to go into an example here talking about initially the soils. There's a lot of ways that people can get soils information, everything from the web soil survey, which is online. You can also do even the old school approach, is just the soil surveys, the hard copied soil surveys, which are becoming harder and harder to find in my experience. Everything is trying to move towards this paperless society, but I'm in most of the conservation districts or soil or NRCS offices. They usually will have an old soil survey that is out there. Something like that, as low tech as a book with pictures and information relating to the type of site. Based off of the soil map that you see, that gives you a number, giving you the type of site, giving you the estimated or expected weights of production that we might see relative to a favorable year, a normal year, or an unfavorable year. And then the typical plants, or what we would expect relative to the most common grasses and or forbs or shrubs that we might expect to see. Just knowing that is a big deal, especially for different areas of your pastures. And so understanding what information is already out there and available is something that's a big deal. And so the web soil survey or an old soil survey manual can be very effective. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the very simple tools or materials that we use. This is an example right here of I mentioned keeping track of grazing records. If you nothing else but have a simple, even in your red books or on even on a spreadsheet, the herd type that you have, cows and calves, replacement heifers, bulls, culls, yearlings, stockers, whatever it might be, but just the pasture that they went into, how many were in it, when they went in, when they came out, how many came out. The size of the herd is right here. That right there allows you to do a whole bunch of analysis, and we'll talk about that just shortly here. But having the records themselves is something that's extremely important. To the right here, uses a great picture, an example of a grazing cage. I can't imagine how we would be able to do monitoring effectively without some way to, on an annual basis, have a protected spot in a pasture so that we can see the actual production that occurred without grazing taking place. And the grazing cage is an extremely effective mechanism in this regard. The example right here you'll see is a pyramid-shaped, three-sided enclosure or exclosure. I don't know what that would be for sure, but that is very easily moved from one point to another if you want to, but is a very durable, very stable, and easily placed and anchored down. And this is something that, if anybody's interested, we have a design. This is a design that we developed over time, and you can go to our website, and there's actually an upload where that you could, under our products category, grazing cages, you can upload the design, and it's made out of the welded cattle panel, 16-foot sheet of welded cattle panel. And you can create this and create an extremely user-friendly type of a grazing protection apparatus that we would move on an annual basis, and that's part of our monitoring. Additionally, there's an example over here on the left side of a rain gauge, and time and time again we've asked people, why they don't have rain gauges everywhere, and they typically say, well, they freeze and break, or we get livestock that rub against them and they break, or we have hailstorms that come through and break them, or they evaporate, the moisture that's in them evaporates before we can get out there. And so we've developed an extremely simple but very durable, we call them a lifetime rain gauge, made out of HDPE pipe with an end butt cap fusion welded on, and then with the top being beveled. And we put in evaporation fluid, aka hydraulic oil, and that will keep the water, the moisture will go underneath the oil, so it minimizes or stops evaporation from taking place. So we can leave these out on a year-round basis and then just go out, and we've got dipsticks that go inside of them, and we can just check the dipstick and see how much moisture we've had on a monthly basis, or sometimes biannually, or sometimes it's a deal where that we oftentimes we'll say, okay, check your recharge the gauges in late September, check them again around tax time, and then check them again around the 4th of July. And if you can get 3 readings, that's better than a single reading. Oftentimes people check them on a monthly basis. Then this lower central picture is an example of what we call a recovery pen. And that's just an area that we set up is for near-term evaluation of rest. And 9 times out of 10, we have estimates of what that rest period should be or could be. We've found that by setting up a short-term exclosure, we can start to see whether there's plant community changes within that pen, within 1 or 2 or 3 years versus what's on the outside. If in that short time period we don't see any plant change taking place inside versus outside, that's telling us that our recovery periods are probably long enough on the outside. If, however, we see plant changes, increased species diversity, maybe more desirable plants, deeper rooted grass plants, warm season, cool seasons, whatever that might be, then inside the cage versus the outside, then that starts to indicate to us that maybe our rest periods aren't long enough. So when somebody says to me, what should my rest periods be, I don't necessarily know what to say, but by looking at the land, you can do that. And so a short-term recovery pen is something that we've found to be extremely helpful for many producers. And so when you take a look at these pictures right here, okay, we've got a grazing cage, there's a rain gauge, there's a recovery pen. This is all super simple stuff, but you can get a lot of information from it. And if you couple that with the information relative to your herd grazing records, you can begin to build a little bit better understanding, and that's where we start thinking a little bit more about going into this next tier, the level 2, and it's still providing feedback for management, but now we're starting to add accuracy, and we're going to gain management insight. And so we really look at that. We've tied mapping into this more. I don't know how many of you are aware of Google Earth. Google Earth is an extremely useful GIS type approach. We've gotten to the point where that we even put on Google Earth trainings for folks just to teach them how to map their own ranches and create sort of a living dynamic map that allows them to store records and put in grazing plans and overlay soils and create three-dimensional production areas and three-dimensional views and a whole bunch of really cool stuff. Considering production relative to accuracy, being able to really put numbers on what production is. We can look in the cage and out of the cage and estimate, but we can also clip that, and so we'll talk about that. The use of a grazing index is something that we found extremely helpful relative to providing not only a report card back to you, but also to give you insight as to what you can do to improve your grazing management, and then starting to tie some photography or images into some monitoring pardon me, is something that you can start to tie into this next level up. And so I'm going to talk about some of those. Mapping. Right here is an example of a Google Earth map, and a very simple diagram, but it shows, you know, at the outer border, it shows the internal fences, it shows areas here's areas of ownership, BLM, private state lands that are here. It also shows places where using Google Earth we can say, okay, we want to set up a monitoring program. This is the sites that we think we want to move towards. And once we got that figured out, there's mechanisms. This is again another Google Earth aspect. There's add-ons that can be done that actually allow you to overlay soils layers with the landscape itself, aspects and that flow with the land patterns that are out there. And you can click on a number and it will tell you the type of soil, and you can click on that soil and it will carry you to information relating to ecological site descriptions or soil survey information, i.e., you know, give you production ranges that you could expect, give you plant types that you would expect relative to that certain soil type. So it's a higher level of technology, but a higher level of available information comes with that as well. And so this idea, that's sort of the mapping, you know, talking about determining production accurately. Going out and doing some clippings can provide a huge amount of information for you, and quite accurate, I might add. And so we typically have got a standard size hoop that we use, a 93-inch circumference. We'll clip everything that we consider grazable. We can determine dry matter either through weighing and drying it, or through a conversion table. We can convert grams to pounds per acre by timesing the dry weight in grams by 20. That's the conversion factor, and that converts to pounds per acre. Very simple way to go out and collect that information. And then, so, you know, here's examples of where that, you know, here's a 325 pound production per acre, and this landscape right here is producing about 450 pounds, and this is an 1,000 pound production, and this is 3,600 pounds and 2,300 pounds and 1,300 pounds. The point is that you can get actual numbers here that are quite accurate, and we've found them to be extremely valuable, especially when we're trying to calculate stocking rates or developing a forage budget for that. And then once we've got that information, here's another example of using Google Earth, and we've actually, you can make three-dimensional, what I call that, designs or diagrams of production, and it very easily shows where we sit relative to overall range condition or productive capacity relative to the landscape that we're using. So once again, a very effective way to portray information. I talked to you a little bit about the grazing index, and the notion is that we're considering, we've made some changes to this grazing index that came out in the 1990s, and we decided that the approach that we're using is we're considering 4 primary factors, 3 of them that are core, and one of them that is one that is not considered in most of the indexes. But the first one that we're looking at is season of grazing, and it happens to be that during the reproductive state, let me back up here just a sec. Each one of these indicators, I guess I would call it, has a scoring range that ranges from +1 to 0 to -1. And so by considering each of these separately, we've got season of grazing, we have season end residual, or how much forage is at the end, we have rest or opportunity, how much rest that plant community received, and we have precipitation. Those are our 4 main categories. And relative to science, they've pretty well determined that, for example, that there's less damage on plants, or I should say there's more stimulation on plants if they're grazed early or late than it is if they're grazed during a reproductive state. And I'll qualify that also with the fact that most of the time this would be on native landscapes. The introduced plants, irrigated type pasture, these plants are much introduced or tame pasture type plants are much more robust and hardy. The concept still applies, but it's more so on native landscapes. So season of grazing is really a big deal. If you'd like more information on any of this, you could go to our website under some of our past newsletters, so it would be under the news category, I believe. You could click on the grazing index explanation, and it goes into more detail. So we can get ourselves a +1 to a 0 to a -1 score on season of grazing. Season end residual, the idea is that we're trying to leave soil cover, and so in this case it would score higher if there's more left than if there's less left. Once again, this is a +1 to -1 category. Something that can be evaluated quite easily with monitoring at the end of the year. The idea of rest is a big one. You'll notice that it goes from +2 to -2. And science primarily has figured that if the plants have enough rest, the rest can compensate for, in this case, has twice the value of either one of these other individual categories that we're dealing with. Rest can make up for a lot of ills. And in some cases, in arid landscapes, less than 20 inches of rainfall, 15 inches, something like that. This category idea of giving it all season or most of the season or half or part or little to none of the season rest applies. With our grazing index, if we are considering it from an irrigated perspective rather than calling it all season, we might say that's 45 days. And most of the season, well, let's use simple numbers. All season might be 60-day rest. Most of the season would be 45 days. Half the season would be 30. Part of the season would be 15. And so you can convert this to days rather than seasonality. And so in this case, +1 to -2. And then precipitation, and this is one that is really not considered in most of the indexing that I've seen. We decided that it's such an important aspect that it should be considered. So in this case, we use it as a qualifier to the score, and so above average would add 1 to the score. Average, it's a break even. If it's below average, we would -1 from the score. So in this example, the blue lines, if it was theoretically grazed, early or late with a high amount left, if it had most of the season to rest, average rainfall, that would give us a +3 score. If it was grazed more during the reproductive process, we used it more, and it was used longer, it had a shorter period of rest, still with average rainfall, it would be a -3 score. And so not only does it give you a way to score this, but it also gives you a way, it's a decision support system in the fact that if you want to increase your rest score, you can see right here that we've got to increase rest. So we've got to come up with management management practices that will allow rest to increase, or to planning processes where that we maybe we don't plan on not stocking it as heavy, and so we can increase the amount that's left, and or change the season of use. So there's not much we can do about precipitation, and so there's that where it's kind of out of our control, unless we're dealing with an irrigated situation. I'm going to move to, so we've talked about this lower tiers of the monitoring pyramid, which really provide feedback. Now what we're going to do is start talking a little bit more about how we improve credibility. And doing that, we've got to increase our confidence. We've got to create the ability to repeatably go out and objectively capture information over time. And so that's where we start getting into permanent monitoring stations of some sort. And this initial level of that is what we call EKG Blink. And this starts to include things like line transects, different lengths of line transects, or photo stations or erosion stations that can be set up that don't necessarily require plant identification skill, but provides a very effective mechanism, time-wise, energy-wise, to go out and collect information. And so we've got some kind of just simple examples of areas where the transect line has been set up. It's always important to have some kind of identification in there, so photography is a big deal. We commonly will look at a plot that we repeatedly go out to along this transect, and we'll take, in this example, this person is taking a landscape shot, but by tying these together, it allows us to ultimately begin to go out and evaluate the system itself. And then we've got what we would call the EKG Pro, and this is a much more comprehensive look at ecologically what's taking place. It's kind of the make or break line. If people have plant identification skills, this thing works really well. If they don't, it can be more frustrating to them. We find that professionals like to use this Pro one, but most ranchers commonly are using the Blink level. And the Blink level still has been extremely effective in our experience thus far. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Pro and just this notion of when we're thinking about these ecological processes. Effectively, they're broken up into 4 categories that people smarter than me ever figured out. But this notion of cycling of nutrients and minerals through the ground, that's kind of what we call the brown cycle. And what we're really looking at is, are nutrients cycling back into the, are there enough nutrients, and are they cycling effectively back into the soil? Because our goal is to recycle as fast as possible. And we typically look at about 4 indicators relative to the nutrient cycling process. Water cycling, we're really looking at bare ground. How much cover is there versus how much is exposed? And our main question is water going in? Is it entering the soil, the landscape, or is it not? Is the soil staying put? And we actually have 6 indicators that we look at in that regard. Then we've got the green cycle, biological state, and that's primarily plants. And we consider them from a desirable category, and then we also consider undesirable plants. And then we always consider species diversity, because that's the big one that we really want to watch, is where do we sit relative to diversity. And we have 5 indicators in that regard. And then ultimately there's the yellow cycle, or energy flow, and this is where we kind of think this is the dollar area. This is where income is generated, and we're trying to ask ourselves how much energy is captured, and then further, how much of it is transferred into other users on the landscape. It's sort of a how much is produced and how much is used kind of aspect, and we look at 5 indicators relative to that. And in looking at that, here's an example of a land EKG, or a land ecograph, and this is an example of a cool fire and a hot fire, a cool season burn, let me call it, and a warm season burn. And you'll see that the blue line indicates the cool season burn, and it maintains a fairly effective nutrient and water cycle. Plant community was not negatively affected, to any large degree. We were seeing, and on the energy flow, some of our canopy abundance had decreased, but some of that had to do with grazing. But our overall plant vigor and the form of the plants actually looked very good. Our big low area was still in the production, but this was actually taken, about 6 months after the fires occurred. And then on this hot fire, you can see that the heat itself scorched the earth to the point where that a lot of the litter and everything was removed, which opened and bared the ground, which negatively affected the water cycling. Plant community still had some positive aspects, but still was below relative what we saw comparatively to the cool season burn. Still, our production was not necessarily as good as we'd liked. However, we will notice that our overall, in this case, when we're looking at the energy flow, we had some disparity relative to grazing management of how much was actually remained at the end of the season. So that's an example of just an ecograph right there. What we found is that as hard and as willing as producers are to go out and set up monitoring, the weak area tends to be in their ability to keep organized records. And so, and not only keep those records, but be able to report them effectively to others. And so we spent a lot of time working on a very simplified server database that allows people to have an account, and they put their monitoring information in. And that information can, here's an example. This is from our home place. You can see that we've got photo points in here. We've got transects that are in here. They're all named. Tells the state that it's in, the precipitation zone that each of these sites is in, when it was established, how many readings, whether annual readings or full-on EKG readings, actually occurred. It's something that that's just a very good overview. We have, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I've got one other example of a slide. Here's an example of, we've got a comparative ability with photography where that you just tell it what years you want to compare, and it will set these up. And so here's an example of a site that we can see from 1 year to 2002 and 2005. Effectively, little change in the overall year, but a big change in the way that we grazed this landscape. And so you can see, especially on this long line picture, a difference in the overall productivity. And this is something that you print out, you can put it in your notebook. You can, it's a PDF, you can email it to the BLM. We send 30 sites worth of monitoring information to the BLM each year, and we do it via email. We send it in PDF format, and they are tickled pink with it. So that's an example relative to using some of the technology that's available. So really, to just give you a summary, this notion of that being able to manage something really does require being able to track it in some way. There's a number of very simple things that we can go to relative to that monitoring pyramid level, everything primarily for decision making, some simple core tactics or tools or devices that can be used. Once again, in the level 2, we are adding accuracy and things like grazing, indexing, and analysis and mapping, but it's still primarily from a decision perspective. The 3rd level allows us to start to really increase our credibility and defense capability, and that gets into our EKG Blink monitoring, primarily because we've got some very effective and repeatable methodologies that allow for a consistent collection of that information. And then from a more comprehensive nature, you can consider the pro level, which really allows us to understand more ecologically the function of the system and provides much more detailed analysis relative to the system itself. And then ultimately, irrespective of what methods that you're using, the ability to store that data, easily, securely, and certainly professionally, is something that we found is especially helpful. And quite frankly, if you're trying to communicate that information and report it, that having that capability is something that we've found to be it transcends the average producer into a level of professionalism that looks great, and they didn't really do any more work. So a big part of our mission really is to help landowners, land stewards optimize their solar profit for their businesses. And we've found that that whole thing comes down to effectively trying to create healthy soil systems with diverse plant and animal communities. And if we can do that, you will optimize productivity of that land, and you can't help but get the support of anyone that's out there, ecologists, environmental organizations, whoever it is. They can't argue, because they want to see those same things. And so I feel that that's a very effective way to try and gear our overall philosophies towards relative to the land stewardship practices that we apply. And so just real quickly, we do everything from help people go out and set up monitoring legitimately across their ranch, and then teach them how to follow on with the monitoring. We've got actual monitoring schools that we do. We've got a number of them this year in Canada and Wyoming, and probably two or three, or one or two in Colorado that's showing up. South Dakota has a possibility of being a school as well. And so it's something that we really specialize in training. We've got land monitoring products. We have monitoring kits that we provide. I've given you a little bit of discussion relative to the Google Earth mapping. Starting February 28th, we'll be starting another Google Earth map training, three-part series. February 28th, March 7th, and March 14th will be that three-part series. And when it occurs, if you're interested, you can go to our website and you can click on the Google Earth map training icon, and you can register there. I mentioned that we've got database software. The Datastore is something that we've found has been extremely helpful in a number of instances. Everything from working with these droughted landscapes to actual court defense, to working with agencies to improving the ability or improving the security for anyone that's dealing with a grazing lease. And I guess I'll just wrap up with the fact, if you'd like more information, you can certainly check out our website, landekg.com. You can stay connected with us with Facebook and Twitter. Jesse's been very active in that regard, and been really elevated our ability to communicate with folks that are out there. Certainly you can be in touch with us with email at office@landekg.com, and our telephone number 406-582-7480 is a number that you can almost always get somebody there. So anyway, I think that's the end of our deal. We did a lot of learning on this presentation right here. We hadn't used this Adobe Connect. We were going to have to do a little bit of follow-up with folks that wanted to attend on this thing. We did not realize that with the test or the trial version that there was a limitation on the number of people that could attend. And so this session is being recorded, and we will be back with you one way or another, providing you this if you're interested in the recording. We will probably put this recording, do some editing, and put this recording. Discussion is that we may put it on YouTube as well. Anyway, I'm trying to think. Jesse, Tom, is there anything else that you can think of that we need to chat about? Okay. Well, I appreciate you tuning in. It looks like it's been about 45 minutes. And if you have any questions, you can give us a shout. Thank you for taking your time to listen to this, and hopefully it provided you with some overview on the purposes and some of the values behind and the uses of monitoring. So with that, I'll go ahead and let you go, and thanks for attending, and you guys have